Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I'm bringing to life another piece of my X-Men Supreme fanfiction series. And once again, that means welcoming the skilled voice talents of my good friend DC-MarvelGirl 1997. As always, I'm honored and humbled by her willingness to offer her time and her effort to this piece. Her passion for X-Men and these characters is truly uncanny, if that's not too fitting a word. She's also not afraid to take up a challenge. That's good because this time she's giving a voice to the White Queen herself, Emma Frost. Now, as I've said before, I wrote this fanfiction series years ago. I approached it as though Marvel had tasked me with rebuilding the X-Men from the ground up. The characters, the premise, and the overarching themes were the same, but the general backgrounds of each character was different. They were still the same iconic characters we know and love, I just changed the path they took to get there. And of all the characters I brought into X-Men Supreme, Emma Frost was by far one of the most challenging to develop. She's one of the X-Men's best characters overall, but she's also as complex as she is beautiful. More than any other character, Emma Frost walks a fine line between hero and villain. She willingly, and often eagerly, navigates the more morally gray areas of being an X-Men and a superhero in general. And throughout the course of X-Men Supreme, I put her in many difficult situations, some of which made the rest of the X-Men very uncomfortable. But she endured and looked fabulous while doing it. That's Emma Frost. That's the White Queen. That's just what she does, and she does it well. This particular excerpt from my Supreme Reflections tie-in is a thorough deep dive into Emma's character. Like others before her, her life in the X-Men Supreme differs somewhat from the comics, but it still leads her down a path that takes her through the Hellfire Club, the X-Men, and beyond. Once again, I cannot thank DC-MarvelGirl enough for taking up this challenging role. And if you get a chance, please check out her YouTube channel. I'll leave a link in the description. Now, without further ado, here is X-Men Supreme Reflections Emma Frost, as voiced by DC-MarvelGirl 1997. Enjoy!
Ah, the joys of motherhood. Is this how it's supposed to feel? It's one of the most basic acts of any living thing. Reproducing is akin to survival. Yet when you've spent a lifetime clawing your way up that food chain, it's easy to lose sight of those basic things that bind everything together. I never had a problem with the sexual part of reproduction. It's the act of actually being responsible for my own children for which I'm horribly ill-equipped. That's as pathetic as it is ironic. I'm Emma Frost. I trained myself to handle anything. Guess that's something else I failed at. I hear it from every loudmouth mother who can't resist throwing her motherhood in everyone's face. Having children changes everything. You stop living for yourself and start living for others. I'll bet those women wouldn't be so annoyingly chipper if they found out they had teenage daughters that were cloned from their stolen eggs. Motherhood is supposed to be instinctive. Those instincts go to hell when cloning, secrecy, and Sebastian Shaw are involved. I can't think of too many ways that my experience with motherhood has been ideal. The only benefit thus far is I never had to go through the so-called joys of childbirth. My pristine womanly form remains as intact as ever. I want to take comfort in that, yet I'm left feeling sick to my stomach for having been so horrendously violated. I should be used to it. I was once a top-class sex worker and an inspiring deviant. I was a poster girl for women who should never have kids. It was part of a less than proud tradition in the Frost family. Sex and deviance are part of our heritage. That's what several generations of obscene greed and wealth will do to a family. Unlike my cuckoos, I was naturally born into this ugly world. My family was from old money. The Frost clan has been ridiculously wealthy for over 6 generations, and my father, Winston Frost, was the latest to inherit that wealth. With my mother, Hazel Frost. They did their parental duty and produced heirs to the Frost fortune. I was one of them, a middle child of 3 daughters. My sisters, Adrian and Cordelia, got a head start into this world. My older brother, Christian, set the standard for the kind of trouble that would plague our family. Giving birth to us was the most effort my parents ever put into their children. They weren't exactly nurturing. They were cold, strict, and about as loving as a hungry grizzly. It didn't help that my father had regular affairs. He didn't try to make it a secret either. I don't even know if he slept in the same room as my mother. Rather than confront him, my mother drowned her sorrows in alcohol. She drank enough vodka to drown a Russian battalion, so it didn't come to anyone's surprise when she came down with liver disease. She died when I was 7. It affected me more than the rest of my siblings. They found it easy to brush aside the death of our mother. My father didn't show much sorrow either. He shed a few tears over her grave and then went back to banging high-class call girls. I was the only one for whom it lingered. It wasn't fair. I didn't understand the world I was living in. I was never truly comfortable in my own skin. That didn't stop me from falling into the Frost tradition of decadence. I barely managed to keep a sliver of my soul anchored to my heart. My siblings embodied a certain element of decadence. Adrian was the oldest and the first one to discover how sex could be used as a weapon. By the time she was 15, she was sleeping with her teachers and blackmailing them to get ahead. Most parents would be horrified by such behavior. For the Frost family, it was business as usual. Cordelia was younger than me and didn't have Adrian's bodily assets, but what she lacked in beauty, she made up for with brilliance. She was definitely the smart one. She skipped several grades ahead of me and found ways to rub it in everyone's face. She had an IQ that most would kill for, and she used her brilliance in the same way Adrian used her body. It got her ahead. Then there was my brother, Christian. He was the second oldest and took a different yet equally deviant route. He didn't care about getting ahead. He only cared about having a good time. He cut class, thumbed his nose at authority, and experimented with drugs at a time when most kids were discovering internet porn. He was also gay, which didn't go over well with my father, but he could care less. By the time he was 17, he lived a rock star lifestyle, minus the music and women. I never grew close to any of my siblings. I didn't have what they had. I wasn't as beautiful as Adrian or smart as Cordelia. I didn't have Christian's spirit for adventure either. I was a complete and total pariah. My whole childhood was spent mostly in isolation. I avoided my siblings, and they avoided me. In ways that protected me from their influence, but it didn't stop them from looking down on me. To them, I was just a frail little blonde, too weak to handle the world. I don't know how I coped. I tried to study so I could keep up with my sisters. I went to a fancy private school and learned inner workings of business at a young age. By some measures, I excelled, but I was not Cordelia. One of the ways I tried to keep away from her was to lock myself in my room, sit all my stuffed animals in a row, and pretend that I was a teacher. It instilled in me a desire to teach that I wouldn't get a chance to explore until much later in life. For most of my childhood, it was a race to see who could be more decadent. That childhood hit a major roadblock that destroyed my family. My siblings all had one essential luxury aside from their own decadent niches. They were completely devoid of empathy. For me, I endured it whether I liked it or not. The beginning of the end for me came shortly after I turned 14. There had been some early warning signs beforehand. Credit cards stopped working and we started getting phone calls from banks. It turns out my father invested our money in an ill-advised business venture. This tech company was supposed to be the next Microsoft, so my father doubled down on it. When their first line of products failed, their CEO resorted to a fraud that would have put Bernie Madoff to shame. This not only destroyed the company, every investor who put their money into it never got a penny in return. My father was the biggest investor, and he staked pretty much our entire family fortune on it. Me and my siblings were completely oblivious. As far as we knew, our family was still obscenely wealthy and kept living that way. As if fate wasn't cruel enough, this was the time when my telepathic powers started manifesting. It was small at first. I would pick up a few stray thoughts from my siblings or my classmates. Then it turned into a real pain. One day, it got to be too much. I happened to pick up on Christian's thoughts while he was in withdrawal from whatever substance he was addicted to at the time. I went to see my father for help. I went to his office where he usually spent hours in seclusion. The door was open and I walked in. He wasn't there, so I was about to leave. Then I heard some angry shouting coming from across the hall. Damn it all to fucking hell! I had heard that kind of obscenity from my father before. It usually led to the kind of outburst that would nominate my father for Child Abuser of the Year. I panicked and ran into a nearby closet where he kept his business suits. I sat down, hugged my knees, and kept as silent as humanly possible while my father stormed in looking as though he was ready to strangle someone. I watched as my father sat down behind his desk and just stared off into space for nearly a half hour. I picked up on some of his thoughts. They were anything but pleasant. All gone. The money is all gone. I'm nothing. I'm weak. Lousy kids don't understand. They'll never understand. When he finally got up, it was to retrieve a 12-gauge shotgun he kept in a case behind his desk. He also retrieved his finest bottle of hard liquor. He spent 5 minutes drinking down every last drop, savoring it in ways that are as disturbing to me now as then. The whole time I felt inclined to do something, but I was just too damn scared. It was the last time I would ever endure such fear. When he was done with the alcohol, he sat down in his seat. Then, with me still watching, he put the shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. I'll never forget the noise I heard. It was so deafening my ears are still ringing. That blast blew the entire top of my father's head off. I actually felt splatters of blood and brain make it through the closet. If that wasn't bad enough, my belonging telepathy fully manifested at that point, so I actually felt my father's mind as it was destroyed. It was a cold, dark feeling that left an indelible impression. It's a feeling I know my cuckoos have experienced. They're young, but they're already stronger than I ever was. They'll never have to endure what I did after that fateful moment. It was the moment where Emma Frost died, and the White Queen was born. The aftermath of my father's death can only be described as a fiasco, wrapped in a disaster, encased in a catastrophe. I was never the same. My siblings were never the same, albeit in a different capacity. Losing a lousy father was a secondary concern. Not having any money is what really spooked them. Adrian and Cordelia tried to acquire what money they could to keep the family going. Christian took whatever he needed to continue his drug habit and skipped town. For me, the shock was almost as bad as my uncontrolled telepathy. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to process my father's death and hearing the thoughts of others. All around me, I was surrounded by crude, dishonest brutes whose thoughts revealed their true nature. I sensed liars, thieves, and people who were just plain crude. They would act one way and think another. It was a troubling sensation, and one that dented my respect for humanity. I remember at my father's funeral sensing the thoughts of the priest. While he was talking about death in the heavens, I heard him thinking about how he was so sick of doing burials for rich pricks like the Frosts. I wouldn't have thought less of him for just that. Then he had to project about how he wanted to get back to snuggling with his boyfriend. By boyfriend, I mean a 19-year-old meth-dealing male prostitute. It seemed as though nobody had any humanity left. Any good a person showed was just a facade. It got to the point where I started fighting back. With my telepathy, I found out about all the sordid and illegal activities my sisters were doing. I found out about everyone Adrian was sleeping with, which in and of itself is enough to fill several minds. I also found out the lengths Cordelia was going to in order to get our fortune back. I was so sick of their deception that I threatened to expose them. Their response was to call the nearest mental hospital and have me committed. That was the last time I ever saw my sisters, and I hope I never see them again. Whatever sisterly affection I had for those two was completely lost in that mental ward. That was a new level of torment that I don't care to experience again. I later found out that Adrian slept with the head of that hospital and made sure that I would cause them no further trouble. I was kept in a secluded cell, given no means of contacting the outside world, and constantly drugged. Being a 15-year-old pretty blonde didn't help either. Some of the orderlies got a little too friendly, to say the least. I was rendered completely powerless. It was in that state where I decided that I started to fight back. First, I had to gain control over my powers. That was an arduous process. Every day during my brief moments of mental clarity, I worked on focusing my telepathy. There was no one there to help me. I had to help myself. Driven by so much anger and bitterness, I was plenty motivated. Eventually, I refined my mental powers to the point where I could start influencing the thoughts of others. I started small, tweaking the perceptions of the doctors so they wouldn't give me as many drugs. Before long, I made it so they would walk into my room and only think they administered a dose. Once I was fully coherent, I planned my escape. I read the minds of every nurse and doctor to find a way out. Adrian made sure I was kept in a very secure wing, so I had to use drastic measures. One night, an armed security guard walked by my door. I pushed my telepathy to the limits and took control of his mind. I had him let me out, and then I had him escort me out of the building. Along the way, other guards and doctors came running after me. I had the guards shoot them or lock them out. I'm pretty sure at least one person died as a result. I don't care to know if he did. When I finally got out, I had the guard give me his car keys, and then I erased his memories of the whole evening. I may have erased more since I was so inexperienced at the time, but I didn't care. It set a new and dangerous precedent. Now I was free and had a new skill to help me fight back against a corrupt world. Adrian had her sexuality, Cordelia had her brains, and Christian had his fearless decadence. I had my telepathy. I planned on using it to fight my way to the top, no matter what the cost. It was that foolish mentality that led to me making the biggest mistake of my life. My girls can joke about that sort of thing now. For me, it was no laughing matter. As soon as I got out of the mental asylum, I had a hell of an uphill battle. I was flat broke, and my sisters were intent on locking me away. I had no one to turn to. I still had plenty of assets. Being a pretty teenage blonde with telepathy put in at a greater advantage than most teenage runaways. My first stop was New York City. That's where Christian had moved after our father died. I didn't go to him begging for help. He wasn't in a position to help much anyways. He was a junkie who was rapidly deteriorating. He was HIV positive on top of that. When I found him lying face down in some dilapidated apartment, I demanded he fork over whatever bit of Frost wealth he had left. He was too weak to really argue. He didn't have much anyways. It was just enough to get the ball rolling. I realized that if I was going to work my way up, I needed to follow the lessons I learned in business school. I needed to foster connections and make deals. A normal teenager's options are limited, but a teenager with telepathy has a lot more going for her. With Christian's money, I bought myself some semi-fancy dresses and an extensive makeover. Then I traveled to the heart of Wall Street and started pillaging thoughts from the rich and overprivileged. I found out about affairs, inside deals, and frauds. With this information, I confronted these men and blackmailed them into giving me money. For those who were a bit too clean for such sordid details, I used another method, one that I learned from Adrian. Instead of telepathy, I would use my pretty blonde appearance to seduce men into sex. I used my telepathy to make them think I was older. When I told them I was only 15 or 16, they were mortified because that meant I could accuse them of statutory rape. Rather than risk their reputation, they parted with their wealth. I made sure they parted with plenty as well. I was certainly not a virgin when I started this, but I quickly discovered that seducing men offered a very special kind of thrill. Beyond the physical pleasures of sex, I felt empowered. By dominating these powerful men as some runaway teenager, I was consumed with an immense satisfaction. I wasn't as bad as my sister, but I'll bet anything that I got more enjoyment out of it than she ever did. It was the first sign that I was heading down a very dark path. With that money, I began rebuilding the opulent lifestyle of a Frost. At age 16, I had money in the bank and a growing list of connections. Then, a new opportunity came my way that would change my life forever. It started with Christian. He was flat broke and withering away from his decadence. He sought me out for money. I refused to give it to him. Then I found out that he didn't come alone. He called in some backup that consisted of a mix of junkies and unruly drug dealers. He must have told them I had money and was easy on the eyes. I could have tried to reach out to my brother. Being locked up and forced to fend for myself left me with little love for my family. When I refused to help him, Christian and his friends attacked me. I hit back with telepathy. I wasn't subtle either. It was the most ruthless attack I had carried out to that point. I hit their minds with the equivalent of a psychic artillery shell. In less than 5 seconds, they were on the ground, writhing in pain while bleeding out through their eyes, nose, and ears. Some of them died, some just suffered brain damage. Christian managed to hold on just long enough to curse me out. He could have reached out to me or at least show some remorse. He showed nothing, so I didn't feel anything when he died right in front of me. I could have left them and continued living my life. However, I picked up on one last presence that had been guarding the door. When I went to him, he was cowering in fear. He must have been one of the lower-ranking dealers, and when he heard the screams of his associates, he must have thought I was demonically possessed. I asked him if there was any reason why I should allow him to live. After some bumbling, he told me he could introduce me to someone with some very good connections. I read his mind to make sure he wasn't bullshitting me. Then I had him take me to this someone. It was a short drive across Manhattan. It ended up being the longest drive of my life. I found out that this seemingly low-ranking dealer was actually one of many spies. He used it to spy for some big corporate entities. Then he got on his boss's bad side and was demoted to monitoring drug trafficking. He figured that by bringing me to his boss, he would be redeemed. His boss was a powerful man, to say the least, and not in the classic criminal underworld. He was something much more devious. He went by only one name, the Black King. When I first met him, I wasn't sure what to think. He was at this upscale and secretive venue known as the Hellfire Club. It was a strip club / brothel for the richest and wealthiest of clients. For me, it was a gold mine. For the man running it, this was merely a playground. His name was Sebastian Shaw, but I didn't find that out until much later. When I met him, he was just the Black King of a mysterious group known as the Inner Circle. The dealer led me into a room where he had just had his way with 3 beautiful women. When he saw me, he wasn't too impressed. Then, when I told him what I could do, he cracked a smile. Then the spy told him how I killed my brother and all his associates. That smile of his grew as the details got more graphic. When he looked at me, I felt like I was in the presence of a titan. He carried himself in a way that went beyond a rich snob. He had the kind of strength that I always aspired to have. He was at the top of that proverbial food chain. So when he offered me an opportunity to join him, I took it. He then asked me a very important question. How far are you willing to go? As far as necessary, I told him. I would come to regret that answer. At the time, I didn't care. I wanted more. Making a living through blackmail wasn't enough. I wanted to be a queen. So the Black King put me on that path. The very first thing he did was put me through some training. This is where I met the Black King's right-hand woman, Tessa. She was a cold and unfeeling woman, but she helped me a great deal. She had an IQ that would have made Cordelia jealous and used it to refine my telepathy. She gave me a series of treatments that maximized my potential. I'm not sure the science behind them, but they worked. One of them helped me manifest my secondary power of forming a diamond-hard shell over my body. It was enthralling. She also brought in a man named Jason Wingard to teach me how to master these powers. By the time I was 17, I was in full control. Once I passed this test, the Black King put me through another grueling ordeal. He sent me to a series of plastic surgeons and paid to have my body enhanced beyond its natural beauty. It wasn't enough for me to be a cute blonde. I had to be a cut above regular beauty. So I had breast implants, a facelift, a nose job, a series of skin treatments, and an extensive array of advanced hair removal. By the time it was over, I wasn't just a new woman. I actually looked the part of a queen. Me being the greedy bitch I was, I loved it. I rewarded the Black King by sleeping with him. I now consider that act on par with bestiality. It disgusts me now, but at the time I was so enthralled I could have slept with Satan himself. That vile act led to my next great challenge. I would have to work in the Hellfire Club as a stripper, using my body and my powers to steal secrets from the rich and powerful. It seemed simple enough, but I had to go beyond what I did before. This is when I got introduced to the Black Queen, who was every bit as devious, if not more so, than the Black King. Celine Gallio was a woman whose presence made even the strongest tremble. As an ambitious and foolish teenager, I was willing to overlook that devious aura of hers. The Black Queen's job was to teach me how to master the arts of sexuality. It wasn't enough to just sleep with powerful men. I had to bring them into a world of ecstasy so great that they would be completely vulnerable. Celine did this with many of Shaw's sex workers, but she took a special interest in me. I'd rather not recall the details of that training. Once it was over, I didn't just have a new appreciation for sex. I had a new fondness for the decadent pleasures of the world. I made sure I put them to good use. I wish I could say I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't deny I took a lot of satisfaction in my job. The first night at the Hellfire Club didn't feel awkward or intimidating. I wasn't the only girl that the Black King took an interest in, so I was determined to set myself apart. There were 30 girls working that night. I made sure I outdid them all. I seduced 5 politicians, 8 CEOs, 3-star athletes, and 2 media mongols. I didn't sleep with all of them, but those that did find their way to my bed were rendered powerless under my spell. I loved it. I got such a thrill out of it. The information I brought the Black King went a long way. It didn't just stop at that one night either. I worked a regular shift, stripping and seducing my way to the prominence. When I wasn't stripping, I was learning from the Black King and his associates. I already took business classes growing up. Under the Black King and the Inner Circle, I took more advanced classes. I learned quickly as well. When the Black King gave me $1 million to manage, I more than quadrupled it in 6 months. It turned into a self-reinforcing cycle of greed and decadence. I would indulge in sexual deviance at night while fueling my insatiable lust for money during the day. This went on for years. The whole time, I knew the Black King was watching me and judging me. I could tell he was preparing me for something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I was convinced that I wanted to be part of it. However, I didn't count on one thing. That tiny sliver of humanity that I retained didn't fade. While I was dazed by this dark world, a part of it still disgusted me. It was easy to drown it in money and pleasure, but this feeling would not leave me. I didn't acknowledge it at the time. Then, someone came along who did. His name was Charles Xavier. Almost as much as the Black King, this man would have a big impact on my life.